Hello and welcome back to our bite-sized video series on digital reform. So far in this series we've looked at the entities that are in scope of the new regulation coming down the tracks and the types of obligations that are going to apply to them. However, it's important to take a step back and to realise that all these upcoming changes from the DSA to the AI Act to the Online Safety and Media Regulation Act, they're all occurring in the context of a much broader legislative framework for in-scope entities, many of whom have a significant compliance burden already with obligations, for example, under the Data Protection Acts. So all of this can be quite an overwhelming list for compliance officers, and in today's video we wanted to focus on practical areas where there might be overlap with existing obligations. And to help provide some insight into this very practical operational topic, I'm joined by my colleague, Lorraine Sheridan, Associate in the Technology and Innovation Group.
Yes, thanks, Aoife. And yeah, there is a lot of legislation coming down the tracks, particularly in the areas of data and digital.
So we're going to mainly focus on the DSA today, and so if we use that as our starting point, I suppose what are some key obligations that organisations should be looking at in terms of compliance?
So I think the first thing to say is that under the DSA, the obligations are cumulative in nature. So it might help to think of it as the inverted pyramid, which we discussed earlier in the series. So the obligations under the DSA will depend on what type of an intermediary you are. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have, I suppose, all the intermediaries, all the in-scope intermediaries who are caught by the Data Protection Act. And then at the very top, we have the VLOPs, the very large online platforms, and the VLOSIs, the very large online search engines. So as you ascend the pyramid, the obligations will increase. And I think that there has been a tendency to focus on maybe just the obligations that apply at the very top of the pyramid. But the Commission has only so far designated a limited number of entities as VLOPs and VLOSIs. So certainly looking at the universal obligations is a good place to start.
Thanks, Lorraine. And I suppose just to do a very quick recap for those who haven't seen the first video in our series where Rory took us through some of the different levels on the pyramid. At the bottom we have our mere conduits, so large number of entities, low number of obligations. Then as we go up we have the hosting services, then we have our online platforms, and then at the top there we have our very large online platforms and very large online search engines. And we do go through the inverted compliance pyramid in more detail in the first video in the series. So I suppose then we come back to the key obligations for in-scope entities then.
Exactly. So the volume of the intermediaries at the bottom of the pyramid is going to be much higher, but they have a more limited number of obligations. Then when we get to the top of the pyramid, we have less entities affected, but the volume of the obligations is much greater.
Okay, and if we start then at the universal obligations, and we don't have time in this video to look at the entirety of the obligations at each level, but could you give us a flavour of some of the key universal obligations that will apply to all of the entities in the pyramid?
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose when we're talking about universal obligations, the first thing that comes to mind is the terms and conditions. So all in-scope entities will have to make available terms and conditions which cover their policies, procedures and measures of how they regulate content, the content moderation. If your service is predominantly directed at minors, you'll have to explain it in clear and easily understandable language any restrictions or conditions which are imposed on the use of those services by minors. While that's a universal obligation, what needs to actually be included in your terms and conditions changes as you ascend the pyramid. Another thing I think comes to mind is the transparency reporting obligations. So entities will have to prepare and publish reports on their content moderation activities. So the DSA sets out a non-exhaustive list of the items that must be covered in those transparency reports. And similar to the terms and conditions, the nature and frequency of those reports changes as you ascend the pyramid, but the obligation to actually produce them is universal. And it's important, I think, also to mention on that one that the Commission has the power to issue templates on the form, content and other details to be included in those transparency reports as well.
Thanks, Lorraine. That's really interesting on transparency, and I suppose with the terms and conditions as well, that we really see transparency as that kind of foundation stone of the DSA really coming through. I suppose another thing that I think is just worth flagging is that many organisations will be in the business of producing transparency reports already to kind of meet industry best practice standards.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of organisations, as you say, will be already producing these transparency reports. So it might just be a case of tweaking those reports in order to fulfil the entity's obligations under the DSA and any guidance from the Commission as well. But it is certainly an area where organisations and compliance officers should maybe look at leveraging what's already best practice in order to satisfy their DSA obligations. And I think similarly, lots of platforms will have terms and conditions in place that they would have worked on maybe, under the GDPR. And it's a good shout out, for compliance officers is to take a step back and look at the work that your organisation has done, particularly over the last 5 years, to comply with the GDPR, and see what work could be leveraged to comply with the DSA obligations, so you're not necessarily reinventing the wheel.
Thanks, Lorraine. That's very helpful on the terms and conditions on transparency reports as the universal obligations that are going to apply to all entities within our compliance pyramid. If we, I suppose, flip it over then and we jump to the top of the pyramid, what are some key obligations jumping out for you for the very large online platforms and very large online search engines?
Yeah, so I think the size of those platforms and the online search engines at the very top, they've the greatest number of users, and I guess that's why they're perceived to present the greatest risks and therefore have heightened obligations under the DSA. So these entities will need to identify, analyse and assess the systemic risks that are posed by the use and functioning of their services. So they'll have to conduct risk assessments at least annually. The DSA sets out specific systemic risks which must be analysed. And these include the dissemination of illegal content, negative effects of gender-based violence, and on children and public health. The DSA also sets out specific mitigation measures for organisations to consider, including those aimed at the protection of children. So the idea is to ensure that platforms are forced to take a step back and assess the risks and the probability and severity of those risks associated with their services.
Thanks, Lorraine. And I know in an earlier video in the series we talked with Shay about the role the compliance function will have in assisting organisations with evaluating systemic risk. But I suppose it really is a prompt for organisations to take that kind of objective step back and look at the risks that may be created by their platform.
Yeah, and a lot of compliance officers will be familiar with the concept of risk assessments in the context of data protection impact assessments that were conducted and are conducted under the GDPR. So in the data protection impact assessments, organisations looked at the processing that they did. They looked at whether it presented a high risk to the rights and fundamental freedoms of data subjects. They looked at what risks and what mitigation steps could be taken against those identified risks. So, the risk assessments under the DSA are a similar concept.
Perfect. So it seems like maybe that understanding of what's required is there, and what's needed is for kind of processes and procedures to be put in place to support the risk assessment process.
Absolutely, and I mean sooner rather than later. It's also worth flagging that when you do your risk assessments, the underlying documentation must be maintained for a number of years after and made available to the Commission and the Digital Services Coordinator upon request as well.
Okay, so I know that's just a flavour of what's coming up under the DSA, and it's clear that organisations who are in scope are going to have quite a heavy lift to fulfil all of these obligations. But I suppose when you talk about risk assessments there, one bell it rings for me is in respect of audit. So I'm just wondering if I could get your views on what the DSA requires in terms of audit.
Again, the DSA places many obligations, one of which is the obligation to do an annual independent audit for the organisation's compliance with the DSA and also any commitments made under codes of practice or crisis protocols. Again, if we're looking at leveraging compliance, a lot of organisations will already have an annual risk or annual audit programme in place, and hopefully it would just be a matter of a plug and play to add the DSA audit obligations to existing audit systems.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. It's clear that there's a lot coming down the tracks for organisations, but hopefully those areas of overlap on the T&Cs, transparency reports, the risk assessments, and also with audit are helpful to compliance officers who are looking to kind of get through this long operational to-do list efficiently. So that's all we have time for in this video, and this is the last video in our bite-sized series on digital reform. All of the videos in the series are available on the Arthur Cox website. Thank you very much for watching.